Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Yesterday, in an expletive-laden rant, Don called Chris McDonough and accused him of twisting his words and lying. When Chris pressed him to explain exactly what he did wrong, Don lost it. Candus could also be heard hollering expletives in the background. What's going on? What's going on, I believe, is we're entering the beginning of the end of the Summer Wells case. Like Chris McDonough, I don't think this case has a snowflake's chance in hell of becoming a cold case. I do think there are a few interesting inferences to draw from yesterday's tirade. So once again, our knowledge base of these people, of these characters, has expanded, has extended. We now know a little bit more about the real Don behind the mask of Don, as well as the real Candus behind the mask. Before we get to today's episode, dealing with day 62 since Summer Wells disappeared, if you haven't subscribed, please do. Have you subscribed? Well, if you haven't, click on the light blue icon on the bottom right of your screen. Like, share, leave a comment. If comments are disabled, as they probably are, head on to Twitter using the hashtag SummerWells. And let's get started. So we're going to go through 5 aspects in terms of interrogating this short little call. I'll obviously put a link in the description. But the first aspect you want to look at is timing. To start off with, as soon as I heard about Don and another minor, a girl apparently 2 years older than Macbeth, we'll refer to her as Ophelia, I expected there to be an explosion. I don't know exactly what McDonough meant when he called Ophelia Don's girlfriend, or what the cryptic remark that, quote, he's got working right now, end quote, means. But I knew that there would be some kind of response, some kind of reaction. So I went to Facebook to observe the fallout, but then it turned out Don called out his accuser directly. Since the beginning, Don's been sensitive and cautious about the subject of SA, have you noticed? Even in his rant, he is careful not to explicate what he's so peed off about. And that is something that Chris McDonough presses him on. He says, be specific about what mistake I made. What is the actual fact that needs to be put out there? And Don didn't want to do that. And when Chris McDonough sort of was adamant, what is the age difference? That was when Don really lost it. I do think it's interesting that this happened over the weekend on a Sunday. What are the chances that Don and Candus lost it while they were under the influence? What do you guys think? Basically a scenario of low impulse control plus intoxication equals even lower impulse control. That brings us to the second aspect, the man and woman behind their masks. And a lot of people were uncomfortable with the idea that they were using the church as a crutch, also to mask something. Well, what do you think about that now? Do you think it's becoming more probable, more likely, more obvious? What do you guys think? I do think when you listen to this thing and you also hear Candus in the background, it feels like quite a contrast from the Don we saw in church and soberly observing things during a rare appearance at a church vigil last week. But Candus as well. Candus, who's been resolute in her role as a mute at these prayer gatherings. You can hear her shouting and swearing in the background. She is capable of saying something. And it seems these are the things she cares about. These are the things she gets emotional about, perhaps even more emotional than about Summer. Chris McDonough also highlighted the irony, if that's the word, of Don, using an expletive while going into Christianity, saying, I know you're a sinner because God says everyone's a sinner, and then actually threatening him sort of after that. And that brings us to the third point, Don's a narcissist. Do you agree with that? People who know me and know my channel know I don't like using that term, specifically that term. I'm resistant to using labels in general and this label in particular, but I do think it's very appropriate in this instance. In the same way that extreme narcissism requires, I guess, extreme narcissistic supply, fuel in other words. Drug addicts require a supply to satisfy their addictions, their craving. There's really not a big difference between a narcissist addiction to narcissistic supply, and it is an addiction, they can't live without it, and a drug addict's addiction to their cocktail of choice. Now what happens when you combine the two? Where you have, well, when you do, you will have a deadly, dangerous, slippery, slithery individual on your hands. When we go to dualdiagnosis.org, they describe narcissism sharing several characteristics with drug obsession, including medication by self, avoiding emotions, embarrassment, denial, lessening, which is another word for minimizing, something that to me epitomizes Don is always minimizing, normalizing, well, that as well, criticizing, feeling low about oneself, dominating behavior, which is another way of saying being controlling, codependency, black and white thoughts, and violence. Besides all that, a common feature of narcissism is substance abuse. So if you accept that diagnosis, then someone who is seriously addicted or a serious alcoholic is probably also suffering from severe narcissism. Their worst enemy is themselves, but within a scenario where everyone else is to blame. And with that, denial is the compounding effect of reality. Things get worse and worse, and when things become particularly dire, the desire to soothe that with substances only increases. As things aggravate, as things agitate, as things worsen, the narcissist needs to feel better about their situation and themselves. And so it creates this vicious cycle. And that brings us to the fourth level, which I think is really fascinating, and we're starting to get a much deeper understanding of the dynamic between Candus and Don. What's really going on in their relationship? What's the real substance of their bond, which I think many people will agree is quite unusual. It's quite an unusual relationship. First of all, we know there's a fairly sizable age gap between Don and Candus. I think that's the first point to stress. Don's 53 years old, turns 54 this year. Candus is 39. Right? I previously said that I suspect Don's a very controlling fellow and probably rules Chalet Wells like a tyrannical ogre, meaning Candus is under his control. That said, I think Candus is quite a tough lady to put up with Don. So although I think she's under his control, as you could clearly hear in the tirade, Candus clearly seems to be supporting Don. So she's under his control, but it's not like it's involuntary. Sometimes it might be, but overall she supports him. Some people were surprised by this, but I'm not sure it's so surprising. I think the pair have been enablers for one another, covering for one another, and equal partners in certain areas of, let's just call it mischief, for quite a long time. I also think they have an equal share in whatever circumstances led to, but more importantly followed, Summer's disappearance. I also think there is potentially an interesting psychological mirror between Candus consorting with 15-year-old Macbeth and Don allegedly doing the same with 17-year-old Ophelia. And that brings us to the fifth and final point. Who's missing? What should all of this ranting and raving be about? Chris McDonough's statement analysis expert made a great observation that in his entire rant on Sunday, he forgot to be upset about Summer. Instead, we see what really upsets him and Candus. What's that? Well, we see what he really cares about is himself. McDonough's expert also described Don as fitting the profile of a groomer. there do seem to be indications of that, including from Summer's father's backstory, going back to his own childhood, which makes the situation of the sleeping arrangements at Chalet Wells, where there's another vulnerable 5-year-old at his mercy, pretty troubling. I don't think there's any doubt that SA plays a role in this story. I think in this regard one has to ask, what did Candus know? And how about Grandma? Just speaking generally, Candus and Don accusing anyone of lying is comical as far as I'm concerned. In the fullness of time, I expect those polygraphs they sat down for to come out. I don't know about you, but have you ever been summoned by the cops to take a lie detector test? I haven't. The cops tend to request these tests because they have reason to believe you're lying, not because they trust you. So Candus and Don calling anyone else out for lying is crazy. It's as crazy as a shot at rat. I mean, the wheels are still turning, but the hamsters died. What we're talking about is nuttier than a squirrel turd, crazy as a sprayed cockroach. In the affidavit of complaint dated October 14, 2020, that's less than a year ago, deputies dispatched to 110 Benhill Road reported that, quote, family members began to fear for Don's return, end quote. I don't know if you experienced any anxiety listening to Don take on Chris. What do you think when Don's totally off his rocker, when he's totally unhinged? What do you think that's like? In this story, as I've said from the beginning, there are excesses involved. The only question is, how extreme are those excesses? I think it's fair to say that more extreme than we can imagine. And as time goes by, Don is exposing more and more of the scale and scope, not only of who he really is, but of the truly ghastly circumstances poor little Summer found herself in, and ultimately got lost inside, drowned inside, and disappeared inside. So I'm not going to take it further than that. I did get an amazing letter today from someone. I really want to share this letter. It's almost like an inside look into FAS, and I'm just waiting for permission to read this letter to you guys, which just paints a portrait of, just giving us more detail of what it is probably like inside the story. It's a raw story about what it is like inside these circumstances. So hopefully I do get permission, and if I do, that'll be the substance of the next episode. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.